Global outrage over the war on Gaza is growing. The massacres and devastation are putting countries under pressure to act against Israel. Some have already announced they're breaking off diplomatic relations. So will this pressure the US and Israel's other Western allies to reconsider their support for the war? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. So, Israel's bombardment of Gaza is now into its second month. More than 10,000 Palestinians have been killed. Huge swathes of the Strip have been reduced to rubble. As public anger grows around the world over what some are calling a genocide, Israel is facing something of a diplomatic backlash. South Africa and Bolivia have severed relations with Tel Aviv. Other countries are recalling their ambassadors and embassy staff. This is seriously setting back Israel's efforts in recent years to establish relations with many nations that boycotted it for decades. So, can these diplomatic moves pressure the US and Israel's other Western allies to push it to at least agree to a humanitarian ceasefire? We'll be discussing this and more with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Sarah Gill.
For 1 month, Gaza has been under unrelenting attack. Continuous airstrikes have left a catastrophic trail of destruction. Every basic service is either not functioning or overwhelmed. Hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, grocery stores and bakeries have been reduced to rubble. More than 10,000 people have been killed. In some of his sharpest remarks yet, the head of the United Nations has called again for a ceasefire and help for those under attack.
The parties to the conflict, and indeed the international community, face an immediate and fundamental responsibility to stop the inhuman collective suffering and dramatically expand humanitarian aid to Gaza.
Israel is facing pressure to stop the strikes not only from the highest ranks at the UN, but also from nations around the world. Several countries have withdrawn their ambassadors from Israel. Bolivia was the first country to sever ties. South Africa is the latest.
We believe the nature of response by Israel has become one of collective punishment, which falls fully outside of the practice of international humanitarian and international human rights law.
As well as growing diplomatic isolation, protests against Israel's war on Gaza are being held around the world, from Jakarta to Washington, D.C. Some countries have even seen their largest demonstrations ever. Israel's staunchest Western allies, including the US, are coming under increasing pressure to reevaluate their position on the war. So, can the Biden administration persuade Israel to at least agree to a humanitarian ceasefire? Sarah Gill for Inside Story.
Well, since the fighting began in Gaza, 9 countries have recalled their ambassadors or have cut off diplomatic relations with Israel. NATO member Turkey has withdrawn its ambassador. So has Israel's neighbour Jordan. That says the country is committing war crimes. South Africa is the latest to join the list. And Bolivia was the first to completely sever ties with Israel. It said its decision was a condemnation of the aggressive and disproportionate Israeli military offensive taking place in Gaza. So let's bring in our guest today. We are stacked with diplomatic and political expertise in Islamabad. We have Maleeha Lodhi, who's a former Pakistani ambassador to the United Kingdom, to the United States and to the United Nations. In Amman, Jawad Anani, who's a former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister in Jordan. And in Pretoria, Kealeboga Mapunye, a Professor of African Politics at the University of South Africa. A warm welcome to each of you. Jawad Anani, I'd like to start with you. Let's cut to the chase. As a former foreign minister, you know well, very well, the machinations of diplomacy. So before we get to the nitty-gritty of Jordan's position, generally, how serious do you think all these diplomatic withdrawals are for Israel? Will Israel heed them as a warning? Will it make any difference as to how they proceed, do you think?
Well, I'm sure they are a little bit concerned about them, but probably they will not dissuade this current government from continuing with the same genocide that it is now practicing. So far, we just heard from Netanyahu that he is going to take care of the security in Gaza for an indefinite period of time. This is just a polite word, not polite, but another word for occupation. And so therefore, instead of allowing the Palestinians the freedom to have their own state, he is now controlling restoring the occupation to Gaza, which the Israelis relinquished under ex-Prime Minister Sharon. So in a way, this is not going anywhere so far, and there is not, and the demands and the United States, and judging from the statements which have been made by Mr. Blinken, Secretary of State, are not encouraging at all. We hear, of course, some changes, some tones in Europe, but that is not echoing yet and not resonating with the Israeli government.
Okay, Maleeha Lodhi, you're former Pakistani ambassador to the UK and the United States and to the UN. Again, you know very well how this all works, but do you sense a growing sense of discord in the global community? Do you think we will see more ties being cut?
I think what we are witnessing right now is that the tide of global opinion has moved decisively against Israel and in solidarity with the Palestinians. I think there are several indicators of this. One, we know that a majority of countries, in fact, almost 2/3, voted for a ceasefire in the UN General Assembly. So you can see that the US and Israel, who opposed the resolution, they were defeated. Second, as you mentioned, more and more countries are severing their ties with Israel or recalling their ambassadors. Three, I think another indicator is that the pro-Palestinian protests across the world are just growing in intensity, and there is a momentum to them, which is really quite unprecedented. And the fourth indicator, I would say, of this change in the tide of global opinion is that we have seen very strong statements from the 18 heads of UN agencies and NGOs that have called for a ceasefire and have expressed shock and horror at what Israel is doing. So we are looking at a changing dynamic here. All of this pressure, I think, is necessary, but still not sufficient to dissuade the United States from its blind support of Israel.
Right, so Maleeha, I was just about to come to that, because it's all very well talking about this change in dynamic and this tide of global opinion, but while Israel has the US support, Maleeha, it doesn't make any difference. It can just proceed as it wishes.
Well, it seems that the only country that Israel will respond to is the United States. But I think the fact that Secretary Blinken has been shuttling between various Middle Eastern countries shows that there is increasing worry in the Biden administration. Also, I think if you look at what's happening at the UN Security Council, after 3 failed attempts to get a resolution through, which would be binding, there is a 4th attempt as I speak. Now, whether the deadlock in the Security Council can be broken or not, we have to wait and see. So far, the gridlock is there, but the US is coming under increasing pressure. And as I said before, this pressure, diplomatic pressure, is necessary, but still not sufficient.
All right, we'll explore the situation at the UN and the UN Security Council in particular shortly, but let's get the view from South Africa now, from Pretoria, Kealeboga. South Africa, of course, a big international player, and such a decision will not have come likely to withdraw the ambassador. Tell us about the considerations that the top brass in South Africa would have been taking into account as they made this decision.
There are quite a number of aspects or factors that led to South Africa's view of withdrawing. Firstly, it is the question of increasing public protests, which we have seen recently, ever since the attacks on Israel by Hamas, and of course the subsequent attacks by the Israeli military on Gaza and civilians and so on. So that is the main thing that, in my view, has led us to this decision whereby South Africa eventually felt that they need to pull out. But we mustn't forget that South Africa, during the apartheid era, many freedom fighters from the African National Congress, from the Pan-Africanist Congress, and other liberation movements were supported by the Palestinians. And to that extent, South Africa feels a very, very strong sense of solidarity with the Palestinians, especially Black South Africans. We are not discounting the fact that there is also a sizable Jewish population here. We should obviously, side with Israel. And the most important thing is that in the diplomatic sphere, withdrawing an ambassador or even cutting diplomatic ties sends a very, very serious message, a strong message. And I think this is what the South Africans are doing, also not just for South Africa, but in line with many African countries, because the African Union has also taken a similar strong position with the statement that they released recently condemning Israel's attacks on Gaza.
Do you think that other African nations will follow suit now?
Do I think the African nations are what? Sorry, can you repeat?
Do you think other African nations will follow suit now?
Absolutely. I think other African nations will follow suit. Currently, it must be said, it would appear that the Africans are divided. African countries are divided. What with countries like Zambia, countries like Kenya, like Ghana, and Congo Republic seemingly supporting Israel. But we must not forget that a divisive war such as this one is quite likely also to invoke what I would call realpolitik. In other words, those countries looking at their own economic and security interests, because Israel has been supporting them in one way or the other in terms of, dealing with drought relief and so on. So we are quite likely to see those states apparently, siding with Israel. But the majority, in my view, and the moral viewpoint seems to rest with the Palestinians because, as the Secretary General Guterres said, this issue is about occupation. And in my view, I also want to stress that we must not forget that we keep talking about the attack of Israel on Gaza or the attacks of Hamas on Israel. We forget that actually this is the issue around the rise of Palestinians to self-determination, which seems to be falling off the radar or of the international global agenda repeatedly.
Jawad, so Jordan has acted decisively, but few other Arab nations have been quite so bold. And it seems that many people on the street are calling for them to do so. Do you think there may yet be more support and decisive action and severing of ties from the Arab world?
Well, thank you. I believe that they should. This is the time that they should, because there is no way for the Arab masses, which are really protesting and expecting more from their leaders, to accept the current status as is, seeing the bloodshed and the devastation and the mayhem which Israel is inflicting on the people of Gaza and also in the West Bank. And if they let this continue in Gaza, then it will probably be transferred to the West Bank as well. And we will see a continuation of this ugliness. I think what we need to see from the Arab leaders who are going to meet for a summit meeting on the 11th of this month, very soon, 5 days from now, they should really make a decision that they should all take a unanimous decision to withdraw their ambassadors, whoever have ambassadors.
But that's pretty unlikely, isn't it? That's pretty unlikely given past performances.
Well, this is what the people expect. Now, whether these people are going to respond to that or not, let's wait and see.
Maleeha, what about in Pakistan? There's been a lot of protests there too, as we've been showing on Al Jazeera, but again, not matched by government action.
Yes, I think the public in Pakistan expected a stronger response from the government, but I think the protest demonstrations show that the people's sentiment in solidarity with the Palestinians remains strong. And I think now the focus is on the meeting or the summit meeting that has been called, where Pakistan will also be present in Riyadh, of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Now, this is the largest Muslim bloc. So we have to wait and see whether any actions emanate from this conference, or whether we're just going to hear a lot of condemnations and denunciations. So this is going to be a key summit. I'm a little surprised that it took a month for this to be convened. But then, as they say, better late than never. Now, these are obviously all ways in which diplomatic pressure is being mounted primarily on the United States, so that it begins to see that its policy, its dysfunctional policy in the Middle East, is going to bring much more grief to the region, as well as to its own policies in the region. Because I think today the United States and many European countries confront a crisis of credibility. As the Secretary General said, this is a crisis about humanity. And I think on that score, we've seen that the United States and many European countries have come up short. They have not shown the kind of compassion for the killings that are going on in Gaza that they really should have, and that their own publics also expect them to do.
Kealeboga, is this all this diplomatic pressure? And if it does build, if more nations sever ties, do you think it will yield anything? Are we going to see at least a chance for a humanitarian pause, at least?
Nick, if I was speaking as a diplomat, I would say probably this would, affect the situation positively and bring about some changes here and there. But as I speak as a student and scholar of politics or political science, I get very, very dejected or disappointed, knowing that this is almost like a tired, musical record. We have been here before, whereby attacks of this nature, violence of this nature erupts, and the international community cries foul, and they try to do some ceasefire here and there, and with people go to Oslo, and then after the signing of the pact or the agreement, it is flouted and it is torn to shreds, and we are back again to here. So I'm a bit pessimistic about what this will bring about. However, like I said in my earlier comments, this, in my view, will bring to bear sufficient or effective pressure, diplomatic pressure, as it were, on the Israeli government, as well as obviously bring about to bear pressure on those governments or countries that might be feeling that they want to sit on the fence or at least to support Israel. Because once there's a lot of noise that is happening at the United Nations Security Council, UN Security General Assembly, and other international platforms, when you bring in the European Union and all the other countries, in my view, we will probably quite likely see, a shift. But a shift to what's the solution, I am not so sure, because there are other factors to consider once we start talking about this more than 1 century, old conflict between Israel and Palestine.
Jawad, in your experience as a top-level politician, you've acted as Foreign Secretary roaming the world, and indeed you know the region, of course, very, very well. How does this crisis rank in terms of global concern about how the war is being executed and where all this could lead?
Well, there is, as your other two honorable interlocutors have said, that there is a growing concern, and you have pointed this out over the world. Eventually, somebody must heed that. The United States, of course, I agree, is the key factor in this equation, and I believe that they should exercise some power. However, we know that President Biden is facing probably tough uphill elections next November. And at the same time, he is looking to probably the interests of the United States that are being tied to Israel. And so in a way, he is hesitant and he's not taking any action. The structure of his cabinet anyway, and his aides who come to this area probably is very much biased and pro-Israeli. So I really think that the internal pressure within the United States can really impact that. If he feels that probably he could lose some of the states, key states, or what we might call swing states, if those turn against him, especially where there are Arab and Muslim majorities, Muslim solid minorities, then probably he would, and those could tip the balance against him especially in some Midwestern states of the United States, and then he probably would not stand a chance of winning next November elections. So in a way, he must be reminded and he must be pressed upon in order to recalculate his political mathematics, political numbers, and at the same time take the right action that we expect a member of the United Nations who has been the primary intermediary in the peace process to take a more just and equitable approach to this problem, especially that we see what we see every day on television. And we have to start also invoking the word genocide, and not only genocide, but the word, this is in an apartheid state. And my friend from South Africa have gone through that experience. There is a deep sense among many Afrikaners that what happened to them is happening to the Palestinians, and there is a deep empathy here. And so therefore, nobody can question the right of the Palestinians to protest and to react to the inflicting pain that doesn't seem to stop.
Right.
Whether we are in fighting, or whether they are resisting, or whether they are accepting the de facto situation which Israel is dictating on their lives.
Okay.
So therefore,
you've all expressed dismay at the failure of the UN Security Council.
Yeah.
Maleeha, you have written about it indeed. China currently has a rotating chair of the UN Security Council. Is that going to make any difference in these coming critical days?
Well, I think China will push very hard for the kind of resolution that the Russians had proposed, which, as you know, was vetoed by the United States, which is a resolution calling for a ceasefire. Now, as I understand it, the E10, or the 10 elected non-permanent members of the Security Council, have put a draft together, but that doesn't call for a ceasefire, not as yet. It calls only for a humanitarian pause. So we're likely to see a great deal of intense negotiation in the days ahead, because there is still no agreement between the Chinese, the Arab countries, and the Russians, who all want a ceasefire, and the United States and its allies, some of whom are non-permanent members also, who still are talking about a short duration pause, which is neither here nor there. Because anything temporary is not going to stop the fighting. It's not going to stop the bloodshed. So I think the push for a Security Council resolution from China, we will see. But whether that's enough for the United States to relent on its position, it's hard to tell right now.
Kealeboga, why is the United States so resolute in its support of Israel, do you think?
I think partly because a sizable majority of the Jewish population, obviously after the Holocaust in Germany and other places, fled to the United States and eventually ended up exercising significant influence in terms of foreign policy, maybe foreign and domestic policy in the U.S. And to that extent, I would attribute this to that kind of influence. However, having said that, we must also know that states are known to sign diplomatic and bilateral pacts that will obviously ensure that one state or one country, one nation supports the other, even when they are facing what the other state might not feel as justifiable to fight, a war that they might think is not winnable. So I agree with some of the panelists that in this regard, the U.S. also is a very, very key player in a sense that it seems to have a better side of the ear of Israel, if one wants to use that phrase. But it will also depend on whether the Israeli regime is willing to listen, because we know in our case, in the South African situation during the apartheid era, when many Western countries were supporting apartheid, we had a similar situation whereby the powerful countries were listening to the minority apartheid government, and of course, discounting the majority voices of the African countries and other people in the African diaspora and globally. So to that extent, I believe that as the phrase has been mentioned, apartheid Israel, it will be very, very important for the U.S. and its allies and other forces, of course, to look at what Israel is doing in terms of, the international human rights law and what others call genocide, to find out whether it is actually justifiable to go to this extent. I know Israel is talking about retaliating and, taking Israel to defend itself, but also we cannot have a humanitarian disaster happening in this time and era of this century, forgetting that this happened during the times of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the Second World War.
Jawad, I just want to wind up the programme with you. We've been talking a lot about the countless, more than 10,000 deaths that we've seen in Gaza, but we haven't spoken of the fear of contagion of this war spreading throughout the region. That is, of course, a very important consideration, isn't it?
Yeah, I believe that, yes, sir, I believe that the longer this war stays, the more it will spread to other regions and other. You cannot escape that fact. International countries will be impacted by that. The world economy is going to be impacted by that. And then some superpower countries will start looking for opportunities to see how they can benefit from the situation. This is not a very nice world all the time. And war, if it continues, of course it will spread. And it will involve many other countries. And the mayhem that would result would probably be uncontrollable. You can start a war, but you cannot probably finish it. So therefore, we have to really try to contain the war, reach a ceasefire immediately. All this baloney about human corridor is just another way of saying that kill them softly. And we need to have a ceasefire where Gazans can have access to their basic needs and start rebuilding their own town. Otherwise, the whole region is going to be on fire.
All right, with that, we'll leave it. Thank you to all our guests, Maleeha, Lodhi, Jawad, Anani, and Kealeboga, Mapunye. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you too for watching. You can find this programme anytime just by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X, formerly Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, it's goodbye for now.